The auctioneer's voice, a slick and practiced monotone, echoed across the manicured lawn. Lot 47, a genuine Louis XVI commode. Do I hear 100,000? Dominic Costello stood by the wrought-iron gates, his knuckles white where he gripped the bars. He wasn't allowed on the property. His property. Men in crisp blue uniforms moved his life out onto the grass, piece by priceless piece, tagging it for sale. His Ferrari, a blood-red F8 Tributo, was already gone. His collection of antique firearms, his tailored Brioni suits, his gaudy marble statues of roaring lions, all of it was being sold off like cheap trinkets at a flea market. He watched a woman in a sharp, dark pantsuit direct the proceedings from the mansion's sprawling veranda. She held a tablet, her expression as cool and unyielding as the granite steps she stood upon. He didn't know her name, but he knew her face. He saw it in his nightmares, a ghost in a cheap waitress uniform, her eyes burning with a fire he had been too arrogant to see. The woman who had owned a greasy spoon diner, the woman he had broken, the woman who, it turned out, had owned him all along. 3 months earlier, the bell above the door of the Portside Grill had chimed, announcing Dominic's arrival like a death knell. He didn't enter a room, he conquered it. His 2 gorillas, Leo and Rico, flanked him, their oversized suits failing to hide the bulk of muscle and metal beneath. The diner fell silent. Regulars who had been laughing over coffee suddenly found their mugs fascinating. Chloe wiped down the counter, her movements economical and calm. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The cloying scent of his $1,000 cologne and cheap menace preceded him. Coffee. Black, he grunted, sliding into a booth. The red vinyl squeaked under his weight. She brought the pot over. "Cream and sugar are on the table," she said, her voice even. He watched her pour, his eyes cold and predatory. "I know how coffee works, sweetheart. Just fill the cup." As she set the pot down, he deliberately nudged the table. The hot liquid sloshed over the rim of the cup, splashing across her hand and forearm. Chloe flinched, biting back a cry as the heat seared her skin. She pulled her hand back, a raw red patch already forming. Dominic smirked. "Clumsy," he said, the word a dismissal of both her pain and her person. "Bring me another, and a steak. Rare. Don't burn it like you just burned yourself." She met his gaze then, and for a fleeting second, the placid surface of her composure rippled. He saw something ancient and hard in her eyes, a flicker of granite that didn't belong on the face of a minimum-wage worker. Then it was gone, replaced by the weary resignation he expected. She returned minutes later with a fresh coffee and took his order without a word. As she placed the cup down, her sleeve caught the corner of a small, silver-plated frame on the table's edge. It was a photo of her father, a smiling man with kind eyes, standing proudly in front of the diner the day he opened it. The frame toppled, hitting the linoleum floor with a sharp crack of glass. "Ah, for God's sake," Dominic sneered, looking down at the fractured image. "What's this junk?" Chloe knelt, her hands trembling slightly as she picked it up. A spiderweb of cracks now ran across her father's face. It was the only thing she had left of him, besides the diner itself. "My father," she said, her voice tight. "He taught you to be a waitress. Should have taught you to be less of a klutz," Dominic said, waving a dismissive hand. "Get my steak." She stood up, her face a pale, emotionless mask. She placed the broken frame carefully behind the counter and went back into the kitchen. The steak was perfect, the coffee was refilled, and the bill was placed on his table without a word. Dominic finished his meal, threw a few crumpled bills onto the table, not enough to even cover the steak, and stood to leave. "Hey," Chloe's voice was quiet, but it cut through the diner's silence. "You're short." He turned slowly, a look of theatrical disbelief on his face. Leo and Rico tensed. "What did you say to me?" "The steak is $35. The coffee is $3. You left $20. Dominic laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He walked back to the table, picked up a $5 bill, and deliberately dropped it onto the floor at her feet. "There, a tip. For your terrible service. Now pick it up." The entire diner held its breath. Chloe looked from his smug face to the crumpled bill on the dirty floor. She didn't move. She just stared at him, that granite flicker back in her eyes, colder this time. "I don't think so," she said softly. His smile vanished. "You have a lot of nerve for a girl who serves slop in a shack. This place." He gestured around the worn but clean diner. "It's a dump. One phone call and I could have the health department shut it down. One misplaced match, and it could all go up in smoke. You understand?" She understood perfectly, but he didn't understand her. He saw a waitress. He didn't see the woman who had spent 6 years as a senior forensic accountant for the Treasury Department, hunting the financial ghosts of men exactly like him. She had dismantled cartels and exposed oligarchs from a keyboard, tracing whispers of data through the darkest corners of the global financial system. She'd left it all behind after her father's sudden death to honor his one dream. This little diner, it was her sanctuary, and he was desecrating it. As he swaggered out, she picked up the bills he'd left on the table. She ran a thumb over them. They were crisp, sequential, fresh from a bank wrap. To Dominic, it was cash. To Chloe, it was a sloppy trail of breadcrumbs. Money laundering 101. He was getting arrogant. He was getting lazy. And he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He hadn't just burned a waitress, he'd poked a sleeping dragon. That night, after closing up, Chloe didn't go home. She went to a small, secure storage unit a town over. Inside, beneath a dusty tarp, was her old life. A rack of servers, multiple monitors, and a hard drive containing the custom-built tracing software she'd designed herself. She plugged everything in, the hum of the fans a familiar, comforting sound. The waitress was gone. The hunter was awake. She started with the bills. Sequential notes meant a recent, large withdrawal. She cross-referenced banking regulations for cash withdrawals over $10,000, flagging institutions in Dominic's known territory. Within 2 hours, she had a hit. A small, privately owned bank in the industrial district, one known for looking the other way. She pulled up the bank's digital infrastructure. It was pathetic, a digital fortress made of cardboard. She slipped past its firewalls like a ghost, not hacking it as much as simply walking through the open front door. She found the transaction records. Dominic Costello's holding company, DC Enterprises, had withdrawn $200,000 in cash that morning, but the money hadn't come from a DC Enterprises account. It had been wired in from a shell corporation based in the Cayman Islands, which was funded by another in Panama, which was in turn funded by a dozen smaller accounts. It was a classic laundering cycle. She saw him, not as a man, but as a constellation of data, a nexus of dirty money, and she saw the pathways. He was moving a lot of capital, preparing for something big. A news search gave her the answer. The Sterling Tower project, a massive downtown skyscraper development. It was his bid for legitimacy, the project that would wash his family name clean and turn his blood money into pristine real estate. The final city planning board vote was in 3 weeks. He was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He had buried the origins of his funding deep. But Chloe didn't need to dig. She knew how to listen. She noticed a name that appeared as a signatory on several of the Panamanian accounts, Arthur Finch. A quick search revealed Finch was a disgraced city planner, fired a decade ago for taking bribes. He was now a consultant. Costello wasn't just funding the project, he was bribing the board to get it approved. Her path was clear. She wouldn't go to the authorities. They were slow, and some were likely on his payroll. She would bleed him. She would hit him where he lived, his wallet and his pride. But first, she had to endure his answer to her defiance. It came 2 nights later. She was washing the last of the dishes when she heard the squeal of tires outside. She looked through the kitchen window and saw Leo and Rico get out of a black sedan. They weren't carrying baseball bats. They were carrying gasoline cans. Her blood ran cold. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the one thing that mattered, the broken picture frame of her father, and slipped out the back door, melting into the alley's shadows just as the front window shattered. She watched from a block away as they doused her father's dream in accelerant. She watched as Rico tossed a lighter, and the diner, her sanctuary, her last connection to her dad, erupted in a roar of orange flame. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. It wasn't just a building. It was memories. It was the smell of her father's coffee, the sound of his laughter, the feel of his hand on her shoulder. And Dominic had turned it all to ash over a $35 steak. The grief was a physical weight, crushing her chest. But beneath it, something else was forged in that fire. The last vestiges of the quiet waitress burned away, leaving only the cold, hard certainty of the hunter. This was no longer about justice. It was about eradication. The Sterling Tower project was being announced at a lavish press conference at the Grand Astoria Hotel in 2 weeks. Dominic would be there, flanked by the mayor and the city council members he'd bought. It was his coronation. It would be his first public execution. Chloe worked with a feverish intensity. She compiled a small, surgically precise file. It contained a single damning piece of evidence, a wire transfer record from one of Dominic's shell corporations directly into an account owned by the wife of Howard Black, the chairman of the city planning board. It was the smoking gun. She didn't need to expose Dominic's entire empire yet. She just needed to cut the head off this one snake. She created a secure, anonymous email address and sent the file to Sarah Jensen, the most tenacious investigative reporter at the city's largest newspaper. The subject line was simple: Sterling Tower's foundation is rotten. She didn't include her name. She didn't need to. The data spoke for itself. The day of the press conference, Chloe sat in a coffee shop across the street, a laptop open in front of her. She watched the live stream. Dominic was at the podium, his face beaming with smug triumph. He was talking about integrity, about building a better future for the city. The hypocrisy was so thick it was nauseating. And it is with great pride, Dominic boomed, that I, along with Mayor Thompson and the esteemed members of the planning board, break ground on this historic. His words were cut off by a flurry of activity in the back of the room. A reporter's phone buzzed, then another, then another. A low murmur rippled through the press corps. Sarah Jensen stood up, her phone held in her hand like a weapon. "Mr. Costello," she called out, her voice sharp. "Can you comment on the $1 million payment made to the wife of Chairman Black 3 days ago from an offshore account linked to your enterprise?" The smile froze on Dominic's face. He looked over at Howard Black, whose face had gone the color of ash. The mayor took a nervous step away from the podium. The cameras, which had been focused on Dominic, now swiveled to capture the chaos. "That's an outrageous and unfounded accusation," Dominic stammered. But the bravado was gone. He looked like a cornered animal. "Is it?" Sarah pressed, walking forward. "Because my paper just published the bank records. Would you like to see them?" The press conference imploded. The Sterling Tower project was dead on arrival, drowned in a tsunami of scandal. Dominic was hustled out a side door by Leo and Rico, his face a mask of pure fury. He had lost hundreds of millions in projected earnings, but more than that, he had been humiliated. Publicly. The man who lived by fear and reputation had been made to look like a fool. Chloe closed her laptop, a grim smile touching her lips for the first time in days. It was a good start, a satisfying taste of karma. But it wasn't enough. He had taken everything from her. She would take everything from him. To do that, she needed more than just financial records. She needed his entire playbook. She needed the heart of his operation. And she had a feeling she knew where he kept it. Dominic's central office was a fortress on the 40th floor of a downtown skyscraper. Getting in was impossible. But every fortress has a service entrance. Chloe spent a week researching the building's third-party contractors. She found a commercial cleaning company with high staff turnover and lax background checks. A forged ID, a cheap uniform, and a confident walk got her past security with a cart full of cleaning supplies. Her target was Dominic's personal office. She had 1 hour. While her co-workers cleaned the main floor, she slipped away. His office door was locked with a high-tech keypad. She pulled a small thermal imaging attachment from her pocket and connected it to her phone. The heat signatures from his fingers earlier in the day were still faintly visible on the keypad. 5, 8, 3, 1, 9, 6. The lock clicked open. Inside, the office was an ode to narcissism. A massive oil painting of Dominic hung on one wall. The desk was carved from a single piece of mahogany. She didn't have time to admire the decor. She worked quickly, planting a tiny, audio-activated listening device under his desk and a keylogger into the back of his computer tower. She was out of the office in under 5 minutes, blending back in with the cleaning crew. No one was the wiser. For the next week, she listened. She sifted through hours of boring phone calls, threats to low-level dealers, and egotistical monologues. Then, she heard it. A panicked phone call between Dominic and Leo after the Sterling Tower debacle. "The whole thing is blown!" Dominic roared over the line. "How did they find out about Black?" "I don't know, boss." Leo's voice was strained. "The accounts were clean. No one should have been able to connect them." "Someone did. This has to be contained. If they get their hands on the Rosso ledger, we're all finished. Is it secure?" "Yes, boss. It's in the wall safe. At the mansion. Same code as always." "It better be," Dominic growled. "That ledger has every name, every payment, every body we ever buried. It's the lifeblood. No one touches it." The Rosso ledger. The red ledger. It was the Holy Grail, the central nervous system of his entire criminal empire, and it was at his mansion. Getting in there would be a suicide mission. But she had to. She began by digging into the mansion's ownership. She needed blueprints, security layouts, anything she could use. She traced the property deed through the city records office. It was owned by a holding company, Viridian Properties LLC. Standard practice for a man like Dominic, hiding his assets. She decided to dig into Viridian, peeling back its corporate layers. She expected another labyrinth of offshore accounts. She ran the LLC's registration number through her old treasury database, a back door she had left for herself for emergencies. The screen filled with incorporation documents, and then she saw it. Her breath hitched in her chest. Her world tilted on its axis. The principal signatory for Viridian Properties LLC, the legal owner, was listed as Robert Miller, her father. It didn't make sense. She frantically pulled up the associated financial records, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The story laid itself out in a series of cold, hard transactions. After the 2008 financial crash, the mansion's original owner had defaulted. The bank had sold off the toxic mortgage debt for pennies on the dollar to clear its books. Her father, a quiet but incredibly shrewd investor, had bought it through a shell company he'd created for rainy day investments. Dominic Costello had bought the mansion years later, but he hadn't bought it outright. He had assumed the mortgage. He had been paying his monthly mortgage payment, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, into a trust account managed by Viridian Properties, an account that, upon her father's death, had transferred directly to her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Dominic Costello, the man who had burned down her father's diner, had been paying rent to her for the past 3 years. He wasn't the owner of his castle, he was a tenant, and he was late on his payments. A slow, cold, beautiful plan began to form in her mind. It was audacious, it was theatrical, and it was perfect. He had used fire to destroy her world. She would use the law, the cold, inescapable power of contracts and property rights, to dismantle his. Dominic's annual charity gala for children's health was his PR masterpiece. It was the one night a year he played the benevolent philanthropist, rubbing elbows with the city's elite, his dirty money laundered clean through champagne and canapes. It was always held at his mansion. This year, it would be his public execution. Chloe spent the next week with a team of lawyers, the best she could afford with the small fortune her father had unknowingly left her. They drew up the paperwork. Foreclosure notices, eviction orders, asset seizure warrants, all perfectly legal, all ironclad. She also made another anonymous call to Sarah Jensen, the reporter. "Dominic Costello's charity gala," she said. "Be there, and bring a camera crew. You're going to want to see the evening's main event." The night of the gala, the mansion was a symphony of excess. Light spilled from every window, painting the manicured lawns in gold. A string quartet played softly on the terrace, while the city's most powerful people, senators, judges, CEOs, mingled, their laughter mixing with the clinking of champagne flutes. Dominic Costello was in his element, the king in his castle. He stood by a massive, tiered fountain, a glass of Macallan 25 in one hand, accepting praise and backslaps. The Sterling Tower scandal was already old news, a minor hiccup. This party was his victory lap, a bold declaration of his untouchability. "To resilience," toasted a portly councilman, raising his glass. "Some people would have crumbled after a little bad press, Dom, but you? Stronger than ever." Dominic beamed, his chest swelling with pride. "Bad press is just free advertising, my friend. It reminds the world who runs this city. You can't kill a lion with a fly swatter." He took a long, slow sip of his scotch, his eyes sweeping over his domain. He felt invincible. He even laughed about the incident that had started it all. Can you believe it all started with some waitress in a greasy spoon? She got what she deserved, her and that little shack. He chuckled, and the men around him chuckled with him, the sound slick and sycophantic. At precisely 9 p.m., a subtle shift occurred. The gentle melody of the string quartet was overshadowed by a low, mechanical hum from the front of the estate. The grand iron gates, which had been admitting a steady stream of luxury cars, swung open with a groan. But it wasn't a late-arriving guest in a limousine. It was a procession of vehicles that were jarringly out of place. A massive, grubby tow truck, its yellow emergency lights strobing, casting lurid, dancing shadows across the terrified faces of the marble lions. A fleet of stark, white moving vans, looking like ghosts against the night, and several black, official-looking sedans from the U.S. Marshals Service. They were followed by Sarah Jensen and her camera crew, the powerful beam of their main light cutting through the party's soft ambience like a surgeon's scalpel. The music faltered, a violinist's bow screeching to a halt mid-note. The hum of polite chatter evaporated into a thick, anxious silence. 100 heads, 100 pairs of curious eyes, turned as one towards the disturbance. A team of federal marshals, led by a grim-faced senior officer, began walking up the long, circular driveway. With them was a team of auctioneers, clipboards in hand. And walking calmly at the very front of the procession, her posture as straight as a blade, her expression unreadable, was Chloe. She was not dressed in a waitress uniform, but in a flawlessly tailored navy blue power suit that seemed to absorb the light, making her a figure of pure, focused intent. Her steps on the gravel were the only sound in the world. Dominic's face, moments before flush with triumph, curdled into a mask of confusion and rage. "What the hell is this? Security!" he snarled, striding forward, his scotch sloshing over the rim of his glass and splashing onto his polished Italian shoe. Leo and Rico, ever his shadows, moved to intercept the approaching group, their hands reaching inside their jackets. "Stand down," the lead marshal commanded, his voice a baritone boom that carried across the lawn with unquestionable authority. His men fanned out, creating a barrier between the party and the newcomers, their hands resting calmly on their sidearms. Leo and Rico froze, their thuggish confidence instantly evaporating in the face of genuine federal power. "What federal matter?" Dominic spat, his eyes ignoring the marshals and locking onto Chloe with venomous intensity. He pointed a trembling finger at her. "What is she doing here? Get this trash off my property. This is a private event." Chloe stopped a few feet from him, the camera light glinting off the cool, calm surface of her eyes. She held up a single, crisp document, the legal print sharp and black against the white paper. "This is a court-ordered eviction notice, Mr. Costello," she said, her voice clear and steady, each word a perfectly placed stone dropped into the dead silent pool of the party. "And an asset seizure warrant." Dominic stared at her, his mind struggling to process the words. Then he threw his head back and let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Eviction? Seizure? I own this place, you stupid, delusional girl. I paid for it in cash years ago. You're insane. You can't seize what's mine." "That's the core of your problem, Dominic. You've spent your whole life taking things that aren't yours," Chloe replied, her voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, more chilling. "But you're mistaken about this house. You think you own it. You assumed the mortgage from the previous owner in a leveraged buyout, a mortgage held by a company called Viridian Properties LLC. Remember them?" He blinked, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Some faceless corporation. Who cares?" "I care," Chloe said, her voice like ice. "My father, Robert Miller, cared. He established Viridian Properties. You were so busy admiring the marble lions, you never bothered to check the deed's provenance. You haven't been living in your house, Dominic. You've been a tenant in mine, and you're 3 months behind on rent." The color drained from Dominic's face as if a plug had been pulled. The expensive tan he cultivated looked sickly and yellow under the harsh camera lights. The crowd let out a collective, audible gasp. Senators and judges exchanged panicked glances. He looked around wildly at the faces of his powerful friends, as if searching for an ally, for someone to tell him this was a joke. He found only stunned, horrified stares. His Scotch glass slipped from his nerveless fingers and shattered on the flagstones, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. That's a lie," he whispered, the sound barely audible. "It's impossible, is it?" Chloe took a step closer, her gaze pinning him. "You like to play with fire. I prefer the cold, clean lines of contract law. It burns slower, but it turns everything to ash just the same. The day you burned down my father's diner, you missed your first mortgage payment. I could have foreclosed then, but that would have been too quick, too merciful. I wanted you to feel safe. I wanted you to stand here, tonight, at the very peak of your arrogance, surrounded by everyone you've conned, so they could all watch you fall. Panic, raw and primal, finally flared in Dominic's eyes. He gestured wildly toward the mansion. "You can't do this! The safe! The ledger! That's private property." "Not anymore," the lead marshal said, stepping forward. "As per the foreclosure judgment, all fixed assets of the property are now under the control of the lien holder pending liquidation. That includes the wall safe. We have a court order to open it." He nodded to a man in a simple work uniform, carrying a heavy tool bag. But the man stopped, and another figure stepped forward from the shadows of the procession. He was an older man, slightly stooped, with kind, tired eyes that Chloe recognized instantly. It was Mr. Henderson, the quiet regular who always sat in the corner booth at the diner, reading his newspaper. The man Dominic had once shoved aside on his way out, snarling, "Get out of the way, old man." Mr. Henderson opened a worn leather tool roll, his hands steady and sure. He looked at Chloe and gave a single, slow nod. "You," Dominic stammered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I know you. The old man from the diner. What the hell are you doing here?" "He's the locksmith," Chloe said simply. "The best safecracker on the East Coast, before he retired. He made an exception for me. For my father." Mr. Henderson paused as he passed Dominic, his quiet voice carrying in the stillness. "You don't remember my son, do you, Mr. Costello? Your man Rico broke his arm a few years back over a protection payment for his bakery. Robert, Chloe's father, he paid the medical bills without a word and helped my boy get back on his feet. This isn't for a fee, Mr. Costello. This is for a friend." The quiet dignity of the moment was another blow to Dominic's crumbling facade. He was being dismantled not just by a ghost from his past, but by the very people he had deemed insignificant. As Mr. Henderson walked towards the study, Leo and Rico looked at Dominic, their eyes wide, awaiting an order to attack, to do something. But Dominic was frozen, a statue of impotent fury, his entire world collapsing in front of an audience of his most important associates and the rolling cameras of the press. From inside the house, they heard the precise, metallic clicks of the locksmith's tools, then a heavy, satisfying clunk as the tumblers fell. A moment later, a marshal emerged, holding a thick, red, leather-bound ledger. He handed it not to Chloe, but to another man who had been waiting patiently near the back. He wore a dark, conservative suit and had the weary, intelligent eyes of a career federal prosecutor. The prosecutor opened the ledger. He read the first page, his eyebrows rising slightly. He flipped to a page in the middle, then to the end. He looked up, his gaze sweeping past the crowd and finding Dominic across the lawn. "Dominic Costello." The prosecutor's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, and absolutely final. "I have a warrant for your arrest, for violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, conspiracy to commit murder, interstate money laundering, bribery of public officials, and, well, the list is quite long. Let's just say we have enough in the first 5 pages of this book to ensure you never see daylight again." It was then that Dominic finally broke. The last thread of his control snapped. He let out an animalistic roar of pure, undiluted fury and lunged, not at the agents, but at Chloe. You bitch! I'll kill you!" He never made it. 2 marshals were on him in an instant, tackling him to the pristine grass of her lawn. He thrashed and cursed, a wild animal caught in a trap, but their movements were efficient and practiced. The sharp, distinct clicks of the handcuffs fastening around his wrists echoed across the silent terrace, each one a punctuation mark at the end of his reign. As they hauled him to his feet, a disheveled, pathetic figure with grass stains on his $1,000 suit, Chloe did one last thing. She had connected her phone to the gala's enormous outdoor projection screen, which was meant to be showing a slideshow of smiling children from the charity. With a single tap of her finger, the image changed. It was now a live, high-resolution feed of the Rosso Ledger's pages, being scanned and projected for everyone to see. Names of politicians, some of whom were standing on the lawn. Bribes paid to judges, one of whom choked on his champagne and collapsed into a rose bush. Orders for hits, with dates and locations. The entire sordid, bloody history of his empire was laid bare for his fair-weather friends to witness. They backed away from him as if he were radioactive, their faces masks of horror and fear, frantically pulling out phones to call their lawyers, wondering if their own names were about to appear on the screen. The last thing Dominic saw as they forced him, struggling and screaming profanities, into the back of a federal car was Chloe, standing on the veranda of her mansion. She was holding the small, cracked picture frame of her father. She looked down at his smiling, unbroken face in the photograph, then back up at the ruined man who had tried to erase his memory. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The silent, unyielding granite of her victory was louder and more terrifying than any shout. Outside the gates, a crowd had gathered. They were the business owners and locals whom Dominic had bullied and bankrupted for years, who had lost their shops to his development projects. They didn't cheer. They didn't jeer. They just watched, silent and still, a sea of solemn faces bearing witness as the car carrying the ruined king drove away into the night. The fire he had started had been answered not with more fire, but with something far colder, far more patient, and far more absolute. A bill, long overdue, that had finally come to be collected.